Good afternoon. I'm Sue Uran, the President and CEO of the Pew Charitable Trusts. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to a timely discussion about science, how scientists can build trust with the public, and lessons from the pandemic that can change science for the better. The latest issue of Trend, and that's Pew's annual journal of facts and trends, is called Science Matters. Each of today's panelists has contributed to Trend with an insightful, forward-thinking article about the role of science in society. This is a topic that has certainly earned our attention as scientists moved with unprecedented speed to develop COVID-19 vaccines, and people confronted an unprecedented disruption to their lives and livelihoods. For millions of Americans, that disruption too often included the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, the loss of a sense of normalcy and control, and for many, the loss of trust in science. In his Trend article, Sudip Parikh, the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, highlights the importance of restoring the public's trust in rigor, transparency, integrity, and reliability of science. And now that getting as many people vaccinated as possible is critical to ending the pandemic, trust in science matters even more. So how do scientists build or rebuild public trust? Sudip urges scientists to be active members of the community and says the only way to build trust is to show the members of the public that we are of them and for them. For Esther Krofa, the executive director of Faster Cures, which is a center at the Milken Institute, the speed at which the biomedical community developed vaccines is too often the exception and not the rule. She notes that for serious illnesses, it can take decades to go from an idea to discovery to treatment. But as you can read in Trend and hear today, Esther and her colleagues are proposing a comprehensive solution for bringing new therapies to market far more quickly. One model could be the rapid combination of government incentives, mandates for collaboration, and information sharing that spurred the development of the COVID-19 vaccines. Now, the pandemic created a profound sense of urgency among scientists. That same urgency should now be applied to other public health challenges, or as Esther notes, now is the time to turn the lessons of today into the practices of tomorrow. Marcia McNutt, who's the president of the National Academy of Sciences, also says the pandemic has lessons for science. She calls the first step that researchers take during an emergency actionable science. For example, developing an effective vaccine and determining the usefulness of masks during the pandemic. That's actionable science. And she notes that large-scale events like the one we're all living through provide additional opportunities for something called strategic science, and that's planning for and preventing future problems that come from the original crisis. Marcia explained how the Academy is bringing together a wide range of experts from a range of disciplines to examine and find ways to mitigate problems that have been created or perhaps exacerbated by the pandemic, such as rental evictions or undermining students' cognitive development, which occurred because of disruptions in their education. And finally, she notes that events like the global virus allow irreplaceable science, which takes advantage of the unique circumstances of the crisis. She points out, for example, that no scientist could have designed an experiment that required millions of people to social distance. But because people were staying apart during the pandemic, researchers have an unprecedented opportunity to study the effects of social distancing on mental health and family relationships. The moderator for today's panel is Molly Irwin, who oversees Pew's research and science portfolio. Her Trend article focuses on how the federal government is building an infrastructure for collecting data. Having the data and science to inform policy, and perhaps as importantly, having legislators and officials who are willing to use it, will determine whether future generations, in Molly's words, inherit a healthier, safer, better educated, and more economically productive nation. You can read all of our panelists' articles at pewtrusts.org/trend. And a reminder to everyone today that we are recording this event. And now I am very pleased to turn this program over to Molly Irwin. Molly.
Thank you, Sue, and thanks to everybody who's joining us today. I really feel quite honored to moderate this panel and share the virtual stage with such a distinguished and thoughtful group of panelists. And I'm delighted to help facilitate the conversation today about science, about building trust, and about the lessons we've been learning over the last year. And this, as Sue just said, has been quite a year for science. Scientists have moved with unprecedented speed to confront the COVID-19 pandemic. And the pandemic perhaps has brought science into the public eye in a way that it hasn't happened before, as we watch this unfold and listen to scientists on the news and see this happening. And with that as a backdrop, I'd like to jump right in with our panelists and start by talking about what we have learned in the last year as we have been confronting the COVID-19 pandemic. And Marcia, I'd like to start with you if I could. In your article, you talk about the fact, as Sue just said, that there may be benefits to leveraging science during a crisis. Explain to us how that's the case.
Well, thanks, Molly, for that question. This is almost a scientific equivalent of there are no atheists in the foxhole. When you have a crisis like this and science rises to the challenge, it is an opportunity like no other to demonstrate not only the worth of educating scientists and having a science workforce, but what the benefits are from decades of investment in basic research. As you already noted, this unprecedented speed at which the vaccine was developed wasn't because of things we just started learning about as the pandemic was descending on us, but rather it was decades of investment in understanding mRNA, understanding how viruses work, understanding different coronaviruses that humanity has encountered in the past. And this is such a great opportunity to convince people not only that science is worth investing in long-term, but when the chips are down, you want the scientists to rise to the challenge. I honestly think that this was science's finest hour.
Fabulous. Let me turn now to Esther, if I can. Scientists, as we have all just noted, excuse me, have accomplished an amazing feat in the last year, developing, producing, administering an effective COVID-19 vaccine in less than a year. In your article, though, you talk about how on a continual basis, scientific discovery should move faster, not just in a crisis. What are the biggest challenges and how do we make that happen? And what do we learn from the last year to accomplish that goal?
Yes, thank you so much, Molly. Really delighted to be here. And absolutely, I really echo the comments that Marcia made, which is really science has been the bright spot in all of this. I do think we need to acknowledge the significant human and economic toll, which was mentioned at the beginning. So we are so heartened to see that science is getting us through this and creating a light at the end of the tunnel, but just such devastation for families. At the same time, we did come through with 3 authorized vaccines, at least here in the US and many more around the world. So we should applaud the role of science in the last many months. There are a lot of lessons to be learned. We did not do everything perfectly, of course, but a few that I wanted to highlight today, which really do echo comments that we have made, positions that we've had at FastCures in the past, which is that we can accelerate biomedical research. We can do so both keeping in mind safety and efficacy, as we all know are quite critical. But for too many patients, the pace of innovation is actually quite too slow. And what we saw during COVID is this incredible level of collaboration that came together from so many different parts of the scientific community. From the federal government side as well, we saw federal agencies collaborate in ways that I'm sure they even had not anticipated doing so in the past, whether FDA or NIH or CDC, the VA, the DoD, importantly, coming into play in terms of getting the vaccines over the finish line, but importantly as well, coordinating on therapeutics and enrollment of patients into those trials. We saw unprecedented levels of even the minority community getting enrolled into the vaccine trials, which was quite helpful for us in tackling the issue of trust, which I know we'll come back and talk about. But we also saw collaboration in the private sector, companies coming together in pre-competitive ways to share data, to share protocols of studies. where they typically would not collaborate on that level, creating alliances as well. The academic research community similarly also came together, sharing information in real time. That's an extremely important point because we had misaligned incentives in the past, right? Everything was focused on tenure or authorship on papers, citations, not necessarily around how quickly can we share data information for the benefit of patients. The second area I'll touch on really briefly is around technology. Marcia talked about this from the perspective of we invested in platforms. We invested in mRNA technology for a long period of time, and those do come back to benefit us in the future. But also technology like telehealth and telemedicine that were used for patients that didn't feel comfortable coming into the hospital, but also technology that enabled patients to participate in clinical trials remotely. I think that's really going to be critical for us as we need to bring more patients into the fold in the future, diversify the patient population, create trials really that are based in and set in the communities where patients live, work, and play. So a lot for us to learn there. And of course, we had innovation in clinical trial design. So a lot of learnings have come forward. And what we really need to do going forward is how do we establish these as ongoing practices, not as silos of excellence, but as practice that's common in our research ecosystem going forward.
Fabulous, thank you. And many of the things that you brought up are topics that we're going to circle back around to. But I want to turn right now to Sudip and ask about how the pandemic has affected the scientific infrastructure. Esther just alluded to this some, but one of the things that you talk about in your article is the speed of science and that you have seen over the last year just a record number of submissions to the Science Journal and other publications. What might we learn from that, and how will that continue in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Molly. We did see an unprecedented number of submissions to the Science family of journals. I know almost all biomedical research journals saw this record volume, and it spoke to the speed with which the scientific enterprise pivoted to COVID. These were already extraordinary times in the sciences in terms of discovery, even before the pandemic. And what we saw was that infrastructure, the human resource, and the human capital pivoting towards really one area that affected us all. And that was extraordinary. And what it led to was a lot of the trends that we had already seen in terms of how scientists interact about their science. It led to speeding those changes up so that things that we thought were going to take years in terms of shifting how scientists communicate and work together happened overnight. It happened overnight, and it really started to open your mind to think that paradigm shifts can happen overnight when there's a forcing function. And my goodness, has the pandemic been a forcing function for science? And so what that meant was scientists were working together in preprint mode. They were reaching out across international borders much more quickly. And those were good things. We saw terrific work in preprints. We also saw the value of peer review. We saw that it was important for the validation that came from peer review. But the preprint, and so for those of you who aren't in the sciences, a preprint is when scientists they've got a discovery or a result they want to share. They write it out, they write it down, and they post it on a publicly available database so that other scientists can start looking at it. And there's wonderful interactions that take place in improving what's there. That's not peer reviewed in terms of peer reviewed beforehand and put on that database. And so then what happens is these scientists then submit those publications into a journal, a scientific journal, like Science Magazine, and we send those out for peer review. And that peer review process usually takes weeks to months. For some of the most important results related to COVID, it took days, and just remarkable speed. That's not always possible because there's human capital involved in that. This is not happening by artificial intelligence. It's happening by professional editors who have an incredible background they've built over 20 and 30 years of looking at the scientific literature. So it's hard to scale, but we're thinking about ways to make that scale happen. The other part that is a downside of that is that others outside of the scientific community were looking at preprints, including journalists. And there are journalists who are very much capable of looking at a preprint and understanding what they're seeing. But we had a lot of journalists who weren't normally used to working in the scientific fields. And they made some mistakes in terms of what to talk about, what was ready for prime time and what wasn't. And part of that is our communication as scientists. How do we communicate with journalists to help explain what's right for general consumption and what's still being worked out in the scientific community? But these are good problems. These are the right problems to have. I love the fact that there are more general beat reporters who now understand science. That's incredibly valuable. The other thing that we saw is the human capital of the scientific enterprise. So the graduate students, the postdocs, the faculty at universities and in industry, they're tired. I mean, they've been working 18-hour days. It's incredible what we're seeing under tremendous stress. And in the way that we've all been working from home, they're working from home as well. And it's taken a toll, particularly on junior faculty. And so we're worried about that part of the scientific enterprise. How do we make sure that the junior scientists, where the diversity actually sits, are going to be able to stay in the pathway towards becoming senior scientists? So there's good and there's bad that came from this at remarkable speed, but we have a lot to learn from it, like Esther said.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd like to follow up on a point that I think all of you made, and that is about speed and innovation, and ask all of you, how do we balance this need for speed and innovation, especially in a crisis, but at other times too, with the need for caution, for making sure we're attentive to ethics in research? How do we get that balance? And let me start with you, Marcia, but I'd like all of you to chime in on this.
Yeah, that's a great question, Molly, because I know that many people have been concerned that the speed with which we've developed these vaccines has limited the quality. I can tell you a little bit about what we've done at the National Academy of Sciences. Before the pandemic, my staff understood that the people and the agencies and the organizations that we advise were screaming for us to give advice faster and better meet the needs of current society in terms of being able to apply science for public good. But yet we were stuck in an outdated model that was very slow. It would, for a consensus report, it would require 2 years of effort generally. And instead, for the pandemic, we were turning around advice in days to weeks because that was the time scale when it was needed. And what we realized was that the kingpin of our quality control is our report review process. And our report review process didn't fundamentally change in terms of its rigor. But given the urgency of the pandemic, the reviewers were willing to turn things around, to prioritize them, turn things around in record time. So I think what the answer to the problem is we have to identify where does the quality control come from and make sure that we can maintain the same quality but under crisis conditions. And, you know, I was so impressed at how scientists, even if they weren't working in virology or infectious diseases, would prioritize reviewing items that really were needed for public decision making.
And I'm happy to chime in on that question as well, Molly, which is that similarly, when you look at the FDA as an example, we've been spending some time studying what has happened retrospectively this past year plus in terms of our lessons learned. When you look at FDA and the staff, they were really burning the candle at both ends. And they were focused on review of existing applications for new therapies, while at the same time responding to this crisis. They did not, however, shortcut their standards. But what they did do is pour in a lot more staff time and resources, and certainly that is unsustainable. So when you ask the question, how do we balance innovation with speed? There's so much around innovation that can be sped without really shortcutting or changing evidentiary standards. Another thing FDA did, they did speed up their guidance documents. Because many times product developers are looking for direction in the kinds of data collection elements they need to have, the inclusion of patients in the studies, just clarifying questions. And in many cases, it'll take FDA usually 6 months, a year to answer some basic questions. They turn that around in weeks and in some cases in days. And so again, there's something to be learned from that. And then certainly what we see from the academic research ecosystem is that it operates on an NIH grant cycle, which takes the time that your grant period is offered to you. But what we saw in the midst of COVID is that because we had this human element of patients are dying, that the pace sped up, whether the IRB process going a little bit more quickly, contracts going a little bit more quickly. Those are the administrative things that we can think about that we can change while keeping rigor, standards, and evidence.
If I can just jump in here too, I remember a year ago now saying to my children that I doubted that a vaccine would be ready in 2020 because I said they won't be able to go through the entire gestation cycle of a human child without having the vaccine in phase B for 9 months. But I was wrong. And the way they did it was they had enough trial participants who were not pregnant that they could approve it, except for expectant mothers and, children hadn't been done yet and things like that, but except for expectant mothers, and they could start rolling it out and getting some of the most vulnerable of our population vaccinated while they waited for the full 9-month gestation. And now it has been approved for pregnant mothers as well.
Wonderful. So what does this look like in a post-pandemic world? Are we able to build this into the system, to the infrastructure moving forward?
Don't you wish that what we did over the last year, we could do for climate change? Because I keep saying to myself, if we had seen this pandemic coming, which some people had predicted, but no one was paying much attention, think of the things we would have done in advance. We would have had vaccines ready to go. We would have stockpiled personal protective equipment. We could have rolled out 5G or at least 3G to the full nation so that children could still get educated and have better access and more people could participate remotely. All sorts of things we would have done, but yet we didn't see it. But we see climate change coming. We know it's coming. We know the time scale. We know when things are going to get badly out of hand as if they aren't already. And where's this urgency for climate change?
I would just say really quickly, and interested in Sudeep's perspective as well, that the response for COVID-19 in many ways has been proof of concept in what we have long talked about. Can we do it more quickly? The resounding answer is, well, it looks like we can absolutely do it much more quickly. And it's also been clarifying in, well, what gets in the way? And I certainly should acknowledge that we can't throw billions of dollars at every individual disease as we've thrown billions of dollars against COVID. And of course, rightfully so because of the nature of this pandemic. However, when we think about Alzheimer's disease, rare disease, oncology, chronic disease, diabetes, seeing this proof of concept can allow us to say, can we leverage infrastructure like NIH's Active or RADx as the Shark Tank model? Can we create grant challenges for NIH or the federal government to invest in biomedical research? And what I am afraid of, if I can be concerned about anything, is that we forget quite quickly and we go back to our normal practices. And what we really need to do is invest in those platforms and technologies, as well as the way we've worked together, and formalize that going forward for other disease conditions.
Yeah, Esther, I couldn't agree with you more. Hearing Marcia talk about, could we do this for climate change? It begs the question, so how did we have this infrastructure? Well, for biomedical research, from 1999 to 2003, we doubled the size of the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest funder in the world of biomedical research. And what that allowed was this infrastructure that we're making use of now, right? So the mRNA vaccines, they are a product of that doubling. If you look at the Vaccine Research Center, which is where the work was done to create the sequence for the mRNA that is in the vaccine, that was constructed and started during the doubling of the NIH. When you look at the grant that funded the seminal work that enabled mRNAs to be used in vaccine by Drew Weissman and Carrico at UPenn, that work was funded by a grant during the NIH doubling. And at that time, 1 in 3 research projects were being funded because of the increase and expansion of funding. Now 1 in 9 is being funded at the National Cancer Institute. And so what that tells me is, are we making, somewhere in the world right now, is there a scientist who is doing that seminal work that we're going to need 20 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 5 years from now for climate change? There is not that kind of expansive research going on right now that was happening in that period 20 years ago in climate change. We've got to make that happen. And you're seeing proposals on the table to make it happen. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but we have to build that infrastructure. And that comes with money. Money matters when it comes to these things.
Great. I'd like to turn now to the topic of trust. This is a theme that runs through all of your articles. And Sudip, in your article, you referenced the Pew Research Center study, which asked people around the globe if they trust scientists to do what's right for the public. And in the US, 38% of Americans said a lot. Where did we get to this place of lack of trust, and how do we build it back? And here I'll start with you, Sudip, but I'd like to open that up to all of you.
Thanks, Molly. I think it's great that we're going to hear from all of us, but I think this is a broad enough topic that there are many things we need to be doing. For me, one of the reasons why I think that we got to this is that scientists have become removed from their communities. It's not because we chose that, but to be a scientist means talking in both with accuracy and with precision, and that requires jargon. And so we become removed from our own communities. And then there's the inequity that comes because a lot of the science happens in university towns. It happens on the East and West Coast. And so we're removed from those communities. And when scientists are removed from communities, they sit in within their own bubbles. It means that there's not relationships that are being formed between scientists and members of their own communities and members of other communities. And when you don't have those relationships, when you don't have them, it's very hard for someone to say, gosh, I don't know the science behind this vaccine, but I know scientists who work in the pharmaceutical. I know scientists who work in academic research related to this. And that relationship tells me that they share values with me. They care about their children, they care about their community, and they care about this nation. When we don't have those relationships formed ahead of time, we don't have the trust upon which to build. When scientists come in and say, I'm here to save the day, that doesn't quite work whenever people haven't met you before. And so I think it's really important that scientists are participating in their community, in the PTA, in the school board, in the county commission. It's really important to do so. So that's one aspect I think is really important.
So,
go ahead, Marcia, please.
yeah, I was just going to say, sometimes we don't even use our own science in this. And social scientists have shown that there are actually 2 dimensions of trust. One dimension is competence, and the other dimension is warmth. And scientists regularly max out the scale in competence. Everyone thinks we're competent, But the warmth part of it is, do you share my values and have my best interests in mind? Or are you just trying to do some experiment to feather your own nest or improve your own career? And as a great example of someone who helps counter this is, I'm sure you've all heard the story of Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, who is the young African-American researcher who was so involved in developing the mRNA vaccine. And she goes out and talks to African-American communities who are vaccine hesitant about how, as she was developing this vaccine, she had her grandmother and her grandfather from rural North Carolina deep in her mind and heart. And that's who she was trying to save. And I'll tell you, it's, if we don't diversify the scientific community so that people see this is someone just like me who did that. And I don't think that they would do something to hurt our community. That is so important. We've got to do more to diversify.
And I would just add here that, COVID-19, I think we all know this very well, made it so clear the divide, racial divide, if you will, in terms of the impact, of the disease on different populations. At the same time that we saw that tremendous investment in science, there was a period of time where we were having a conversation about how do we enroll diverse patient populations into these COVID trials so that they're reflective of those who have been affected, either by worse health outcomes or have even died. And I think that is the role of building trust, which is to represent the community that you're trying to serve and ensure that we're opening up and broadening the pie, that everyone can participate. I think scientists need to do a better job describing their science to the layman and not making it the inverse, which is you should understand us. It's rather we should understand you, and we should communicate to you in a way that reflects why our science matters and how it improves your daily lives. I think also that we need to explain quite clearly, many times, particularly in the African-American community, we point to the Tuskegee issue or past issues and challenges. But what we don't say is this is what we're doing differently. This is the change that we have made across our medical research ecosystem to hold ourselves accountable to higher standards. And then guess what? You can join us. You can participate. I think NIH's All of Us research effort is really doing a good job of this. But there's a role to play for all of us, including even from the private sector perspective and industry, where we need to invest in local communities where we are closer to people and how they live and have questions about common things that relate to their everyday lives. All of that will build trust in science.
Thank you all. Well, one of the things, let's talk about this issue of communication and speaking in a language that folks understand. How do we do that when science is messy? It's an iterative process. As we saw over the last year, we learn things, we take action, we learn something else, and we maybe go in a little bit different direction. That's confusing. How do we talk about that?
So I can tell you, Molly, one approach that I've used with some success, and that is to describe the three different facets of science. One is the scientific method. Scientific method is the bedrock of everything we do. And I tell people, anyone who uses the scientific method can be a scientist. You don't have to have fancy degrees. You don't have to have, all you have to do is have an idea. You have to develop a process for testing it. And then you have to show your work for other people to critique. And that is the bedrock of the scientific method. Then I say that scientific studies are sort of like a game of giant Jenga, where you have all these blocks of wood that you develop into a tower. And brick by brick, scientific understanding is built on individual studies, but any one of those individual studies is subject to revision, to critique, into being overturned. And when you do overturn it, you have to pull it out of your giant Jenga tower and see whether your tower still holds, whether the scientific truths that are indicated by all those studies still hold. But once too many of those pieces of wood are pulled out of your tower, the whole tower collapses. And we call that a paradigm shift. And as long as that tower is standing, that is a scientific consensus. A scientific consensus doesn't come from one study. It's hard won. It occasionally gets overturned. But I think if we talk about the difference between the scientific method and a scientific consensus, and how a study in between those is just that and always subject to being revisited, then I think it helps people understand that science isn't one thing. It's actually these three things.
I love those descriptions. They're very visual. You know, when I spent 9 years working in the Senate for the Appropriations Committee and trying to communicate science there. And one of the things that I learned was that we scientists like to speak with accuracy and precision. You know, we want to both tell you what's right and also tell you very specifically how it's right. And what I learned is that in many normal forms of communication, you just don't have the time for both accuracy and precision. You have to become comfortable with speaking accurately through metaphor and maybe with a little bit less precision. And it led to some really interesting conversations in the Senate. So, for example, I had a senator ask me about an amendment that was being offered to an appropriations bill that would have banned animal-human hybrids. It means, you know, nobody wants horse people walking around. And so it sounded like a good idea. The problem was it was, you know, legislation is a very blunt tool, and it banned recombinant DNA. Which for those of you who don't do science, it's integral to all modern biomedical research. And so I was called to ask, hey, can you tell me an experiment that would be banned by this amendment? And so this is the early 2000s, and so I was very excited about something called green fluorescent protein and how it could tell you about where molecules were expressing in different cells. And the senator looked at me and he said, "That's great, Sudip, but tell me something that I can talk about," because I was being much too precise and much too accurate. And so then I reached back into an example that wasn't as probably on point if I was talking to a scientist, but that made sense to him. And so I talked about the fact that there was a fertility test where you take a human sperm and a hamster egg and you put them together. And nothing happens, but you're checking the quality of the sperm, and I was really proud of myself for this. And the senator sort of leaned back, and then he looked at me and he said, "What's a hamster?" And of course I thought he was kidding, so I said, "Hey, I think it's a mammal, and it's bigger than a mouse and smaller than an aardvark." And then of course I was mad at myself because I'm not sure I know what an aardvark is, and so I was hoping he didn't ask that. But he took that in. He went on the Senate floor and he made a little bit of a mess of it. But at the end of the day, he influenced a lot of other senators because he voted the right way and people followed him. And so that came from two things. One is the example that was not quite as precise, but that got the message across. The second is the trust that they had in a person like me because they had a relationship with me ahead of time. And I think those two things are really critical to getting that point across to the lay public.
I would just say two things. What an incredible story. One, we need to set expectations with the public that science is iterative and it is messy. And that's why we talk about it either takes 30 years to go from idea all the way through to the bedside, or 10 to 15 years to create a new product. And that's when we're lucky. That's when we get to actually a successful outcome. And much of innovation is you've gotten something wrong, you try it again. We don't necessarily set expectations well with patients or with the public because there's an expectation that the public wants either a cure or an effective treatment. And in order to get there, it is a long journey. And we can, if we, again, leverage the existing base of the science, but set expectations. The other is transparency when we don't know all of the right information. And I think we have seen that come across loud and clear in this past year. When we're dealing with something that is novel, there are more questions than there are answers. And of course, that happens many times in science. when you answer a question, it opens up yet another question. But just to say, we don't know yet, and to say it consistently and to say it often, it feels uncomfortable, and it can feel uncomfortable for the public, but that's actually how you build that trust. And that is actually how you help individuals benefit from ultimately what comes through when we do get to a successful outcome.
Yeah, I also hear people saying, I read one article that says coffee is good for you, another one that says coffee is bad for you, or red wine is good for you, red wine is bad for you. And they said, this confuses me because it seems like the science is always changing their minds. And what I answer is that the problem is actually with the headlines, because they don't actually say, who is you? And what's their criteria for deciding when something's good or bad? Because something like coffee or red wine can be fine in moderation for some people, but maybe not for others. So you have to define the who is, and then you have to say, in what ways is it good or bad? I know a lot of people who can't really get out of bed in the morning without coffee. So, you know, in that case, maybe they do need their cup. But better defining what the criteria are and who the target audience is, I think could help.
Fabulous. I'd like to turn the conversation back to the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of you have talked about it. We know that people of color and women are underrepresented in STEM fields. The three of you are fabulous role models. What can we do to encourage and support a more diverse STEM workforce? And let's start, Sudip, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think we should start by saying that that diversifying the STEM workforce in no way diminishes scientific excellence. In fact, it enhances it. I think that you know, I often hear that somehow highlighting the previously ignored is in some way diminishing the folks who are already admired, right? The folks who've been doing research for a long time. I don't think that's the case at all. And here's, let me tell you why. Because the fact that we have this amazingly diverse country that has diversity of thought and diversity of experience is what brings together these incredibly diverse teams that are capable of what I think of as orthogonal thinking. And Marcia, you mentioned Kizzmekia Corbett. There was a wonderful editorial by Tony Fauci in Science this week, where he goes through and names the team, the individuals, the very individuals who are responsible for the mRNA vaccine. And I wrote a companion piece to it because I was amazed by this. It includes white Americans, Black Americans, immigrants, men, women, international collaborators. And you know, you would say, gosh, is that an exception? It's not. It is the rule in good science. It is the rule in good science. And so how do we make it more possible? Like this is a system-wide problem, and it requires system-wide answers. And so I can talk about I'll talk about one piece of it and then stop. The piece I'm really interested in is how do we get people who are already in the sciences to stay in the sciences? Retention. And I mentioned before that COVID has brought out this real challenge for junior scientists who've had to deal with children and taking care of parents while also doing their science. And this has a disproportionate effect on women and minorities in the sciences. And we need to make sure that as we come out of COVID, that the pathway for scientists, for junior scientists, is a good one that actually wants you to be a scientist. If I'm the parent if I'm the parent of a first generation college student, why in the world would I want them to go into a job that requires them to be 35 before they're independent, 35 before they are financially independent? We've got to make sure that we have a pathway that is appealing to smart students, regardless of whether they're going up in Appalachia, in LA, or in New York. We want to make sure that that this is appealing to young scientists. That's one aspect, but there's many more.
So I'll put in two words. One is harassment, and the other is racism. So there are studies out from the National Academy that show that unless we change the culture of science, and don't expect women and underrepresented groups to change themselves, we have to change the culture of science to eliminate racism and eliminate sexual harassment. We know that we've had women getting graduate degrees for many, many decades, and they're still underrepresented at the top levels. And it's not because they aren't entering the field, it's because they are not feeling welcome. So we have to do what we can to deal with those two systemic problems within the science community. But one thing, I'll just give you a short story because it underscores your point, Sudeep, about how diversity is really what makes us strong. When I was editor-in-chief of Science, I took a trip to China at their request to talk to them about what it takes to be a top-notch research lab and get your work published in Science. And I looked around and I said, you know, all the top labs in the US that are producing great articles for Science are far more diverse than what you have in your lab. Your lab is completely Chinese. It's mostly Chinese men. I said, you've really got to change that. So then 2 years later, we had 3 cover articles from China. So I went back to China to see what had changed. And those labs looked like a United Nations.
You know, what I would just say is that if we don't have the appropriate representation, we actually leave good science on the table. And that should be a motivating factor, because the reason people enter the scientific field is they want to make a difference. They want to make a difference at an individual level. They want to make a difference at a population level, and certainly want to see the progress of innovation. And when we don't have different communities, either the science workforce itself or the patients in which they engage, we actually leave science behind. And I think that should give all of us pause. It's interesting and what a reflective time it is for our country right now, as we're so focused on this issue and this topic. I think rightfully so. I do agree that it is a systemic issue and it requires systemic changes, including new investments. We're talking all the way through the entire education spectrum. When I reflect on my own story, it was all of those teachers who encouraged me in middle school and in high school, and then went on to great universities. We had that continual mentorship. Again, should we rely on just that? You know, can we create programs that encourage and create pathways of opportunity in a way that feels seamless and genuine? I mean, I think there's so many ways that we can tackle this issue, but it is important to know that we have this national reckoning, and that we should really squarely sit within this national reckoning and identify very specific, paths forward. What I would say, we need a plan. We need a national plan. Because I've been in many conversations and many roundtables and many panels, and we're working on an initiative through our organization at Faster Cures around diversity in clinical trials and diversity in the healthcare workforce. But we need a plan. We need someone who's in charge of that plan. As we saw, if we all come together, we can get to tangible solutions, but we can't continue to try to solve this in our own silos. But overall, I do have a higher level of optimism.
Wonderful. I mean, Esther, you just said this. I'd like to turn a little bit. We both are thinking about diversity in the STEM workforce, but also thinking about diversity and inclusion in the science that we do. How do we include diverse communities? How do we overcome the distrust because of missteps in the past?
You know, one specific thing that, I referenced our effort around diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. One thing that we recognized, even within our organization, is that we talk to the same people and we have the same voices around the table. And we realized that we need to get outside of the DC bubble and get into communities and try to bring in diverse voices from people who are actually on the ground, engaging with patients, engaging with their church members, engaging on very specific community level issues. And I do think that's part of this equation as well, which is not preaching to the choir, but getting out of our comfort zones a little bit, walking a mile in someone else's shoes, it informs your solution sets in a much more concrete way. Just a quick example about how we can try to get there.
So that's fabulous, and very much tied into this is stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? Who should be at the table? And to Esther's point, how do we not preach to the choir, but become part of the choir, right? So who are the stakeholders and how do we get them involved? And let's start with Sudip on that one.
Yeah, the stakeholders, in my opinion, start with, well, who are the people that we're trying to affect with this science? And so Alondra Nelson, who is now the deputy at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, was a board member of our organization. She has this wonderful line where she talks about it matters who is designing the algorithm. It matters who is inputting the variables. It matters who is designing the experiment, because then you see that not by malice, but by simple blind spots, we have algorithms, we have experiments that are missing key parts of our population. And so I think that the way to get those stakeholders at the table is to have them, again, as part of that scientific workforce. And I don't think that we should think of our stakeholders only in terms of the things that divide us. I think that in many ways, our stakeholders are also in the things that unite us. So when we're talking about climate change, my goodness, if there's anything that should be uniting us, it's climate change. That is going to affect every single person on this planet. And so how do we both bring those stakeholders to the table and talk about it through the prism of where they live? If you live on an island in the Pacific, you have a different relationship with climate change than if you live in the middle of the United States. But you still have that relationship, and we've got to bring folks together so that they see that those two things are interrelated. And that's going to come from, again, having scientists that are diverse as well. We have to go to have trusted communications with all those stakeholders.
So Esther, one of the things that you talk about is in order to do this, to build these bridges with different stakeholders, we need to look at the incentive structures. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about our healthcare system overall in terms of the access points. You have to think about how do we fund just that basic entry point? Who has access to that entry point? Because that is your first step of engagement with science in some ways, or with providers that lead you into that scientific community. So I think fundamentally we have to re-examine, how do we pay for our programs and to whom do our programs benefit? When we look across both Medicare and Medicaid, we even have different incentives to enable participation, for example, in clinical trials. Just recently, Medicaid made a change in terms of allowing for patients to have their care reimbursed while they're going through a clinical trial. I mean, it goes to very specific policy solutions that really tie into where we put different models of money for different patient populations. When we think about even the clinical trial enterprise and bringing in more providers from community-based settings, there's no financial incentive to do so. If you're not a large academic site that's getting grants from multiple different sources, can we create add-on payments, for example? We did so for COVID, very small add-on payments for providers to participate in those COVID trials. Can we make that permanent? Those are just, funding considerations for our large federal programs, but this translates as well when we think about outreach programs, bringing community-based organizations along in terms of education and that ongoing engagement. And then finally, I would say in terms of incentives, we get what we pay for in terms of science, and we get the results of collaboration or lack thereof that we pay for. That needs to be part of the equation when we think about the incentives, for example, embedded within NIH grants, PCORI grants, and others that really allow for us to decide what our priorities are embedded into those applications to define our outcomes. But absolutely, I think, Sudip said it earlier, money matters in many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I'll add to this is that I've constantly been surprised at how many organizations and groups of people don't act in their own best interests. And as an example, it's been well known that companies with more diverse boards are more productive, they're more profitable, they're better performing. And yet, California, the state that I'm in right now, actually had to pass a law saying that boards had to have gender diversity on them because companies just weren't acting in their own best interests. And I think the same holds for science. We know that if someone isn't in the room, if they aren't sitting around the table, then it's very likely their perspectives won't be addressed and that whatever solution is going to come up short. And we need to have that same commitment within science to make sure that people are in the room, sitting around the table. This is something we really strive for at the National Academy. We do a lot of decadal studies. We do a lot of studies on research frontiers. And it's really important that we always strive to have a diverse group in there, because if you aren't writing the roadmap, you aren't on the map.
I think that's such a good point. We spend a lot of time talking about how to communicate science better, but also should be talking about how do we include others in defining what the questions are and thinking about what the needs are. And I know, Sudip, the AAAS program spends a lot of time bringing scientists together with stakeholders so there's that two-way flow of information. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Just quickly, it's important that scientists, I mentioned they should be in their communities. We have programs that put scientists in the halls of Congress for a year, not for a week, not for 2 weeks, a year. You need to be part of that ecosystem. We have programs that put scientists in executive branch agencies for a year or two. We have programs that put science into seminaries. Because seminaries are where the future pastors of the country are learning their craft, and they may not agree with everything that they hear, but they hear it and they build a relationship, and that relationship can come in handy. When you've built a relationship over the course of 6 weeks or 6 months, 20 years from now, you can make that phone call. And that is so important. We have programs that put scientists in media rooms, so in newspapers and television stations around the country. These types of relationships, they may last, the embedded part may last for a year, but the relationship lasts for a career. And when you have that, what I'm hoping is that the next crisis that happens, that a junior scientist now can call their collaborator in Beijing, but they can also be able to have a conversation with a journalist that they know. They can have a conversation with a leader in the faith community who can influence their flock. And I think that those relationships matter, and we've got to build them up over time.
That's fabulous. We are getting very close to time. We have gotten a few audience questions, and I want to at least get one of these to you because I think it's really important and timely. And that is, what effect will the recent pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine have on public trust?
I will just say that I applaud both FDA, CDC, and our public officials for making that call to pause and evaluate the data and evidence. Earlier, I talked about transparency and sharing what we know and what we don't know. Doing that, I think, actually can contribute to trust, to say that we're taking this extremely seriously, we're looking at all available data, and we're providing good information back to the public. So the process itself should increase and enable trust. And again, at the same time, we need to continue to learn and to communicate out. But really, for me, it's a trust building experience, not necessarily a trust eliminating experience.
Fabulous. So we are down to the wire. I would like to do a quick lightning round with one more audience question, one sentence each. What's the next crisis that we should be prepared for and starting to invest in? Starting with you, Sudip.
Antibiotic resistance scares me to death. So if you had to name one, I'd say that.
Marcia?
I've already said climate change. It's going to be on us in this decade, and the duration of the infrastructure we've already built on fossil fuels is not going away within the next decade.
Esther?
I agree with Sudip. I was going to say AMR as well, but also another potential pathogen that we don't yet know. So we need to have a process in place to track these as early, as quickly as possible.
Wonderful. With that, I want to thank all of you for contributing to the Trust Magazine Science Matters issue and participating in this really fabulous conversation for the last hour. Thank you. Thanks to the audience for joining us. And we look forward to seeing everybody soon for the next one of these.
All right.
Thank
Thank you,
Molly.
Molly, for your great moderation.
Thank you.
Thank you.